Naomi Carter was driving home, trying to shake off the exhaustion that had settled over her after a demanding day. A dedicated educator and passionate advocate for justice, she prided herself on inspiring her students through her work and example. She was proud of her roots, her black skin a symbol of strength and resilience in a world that often judged her for it. But tonight, all she wanted was to get home to her husband, Marcus Carter, a man whose work in government often mirrored her own fight against injustice. The car hummed steadily along the road, a soothing rhythm punctuated by the soft strains of instrumental music. Naomi was almost home, the familiar landmarks passing one by one. But then, the flashing red and blue lights of a police car appeared in her rearview mirror. Her chest tightened. She hadn't violated any traffic rules, and her paperwork was in perfect order. Still, an uneasy feeling settled in. She had lived enough to know that rules and fairness didn't always apply equally. The patrol car sped up, swerving sharply in front of her to force her to stop. Her heart pounded as she guided her car onto the shoulder. Hands gripping the wheel tightly, she exhaled and braced herself. 2 officers exited the patrol car, their movements slow and deliberate, almost theatrical. Naomi couldn't help but notice the smug expressions on their faces as they approached. The taller officer knocked on her window while the stockier one stayed back, his eyes scanning her vehicle. Naomi lowered the window, her posture calm but her mind racing. She studied their body language, their overly confident strides. It was clear this was not a routine stop. Years of facing prejudice told her this would be more than just a check of her registration. Without a word of explanation, the taller officer gestured for her documents. Naomi complied immediately, handing over her license and registration. He studied the papers longer than necessary, his gaze lingering on her name before returning to her face with a smirk. She met his eyes, refusing to look away, even as her pulse quickened. "This car seems a little too nice for you," he said flatly, his tone laced with condescension. Naomi remained silent, unwilling to engage. She had learned long ago that silence often spoke louder than words. But inside, anger simmered. She had worked hard for everything she owned, and she wasn't going to let a stranger's prejudice diminish her accomplishments. The officer continued flipping through her paperwork as if searching for something. "Looks like your registration might be expired. We'll need to verify that." Naomi's stomach dropped. She knew her documents were in perfect order. She had checked them before leaving earlier that day. But the officer's tone wasn't about confirming facts, it was about power. She reached for her phone, intending to record the interaction, but the second officer moved quickly, his hand snatching it away before she could press the record button. The phone hit the pavement with a crack, the screen shattering. The first officer stepped forward, grinding the device beneath his boot. Naomi's breath caught in her throat as anger and disbelief surged through her. "You had no right to do that," she said, her voice steady despite the storm brewing inside her. The officer leaned closer, his face inches from hers, his voice low and menacing. "Tonight, you'll learn who has the rights here." Before she could react, they yanked open her car door and dragged her out. The world around her blurred as they forced her face down against the hood of her car, cuffing her wrists behind her back. Cars sped by, their passengers ignoring the scene unfolding on the roadside. The humiliation was sharp, but Naomi held her head high, her heart pounding with defiance. Standing nearby, the second officer smirked as he circled the vehicle, inspecting it like a predator toying with prey. Naomi's thoughts shifted to Marcus. She knew he would fight for her, as he always had. He had promised her she would never stand alone against injustice. But in this moment, surrounded by hostility and stripped of her dignity, she felt an overwhelming sense of vulnerability. The officers stood back, leaving her bent over the car, her hands restrained. Tears threatened to rise, but Naomi refused to let them fall. She wasn't going to let this moment define her. As the sounds of passing traffic filled her ears, she made a silent vow: this humiliation wouldn't go unanswered. Her voice would be heard, and the truth would come to light. Naomi's hands were cuffed behind her back, the cold steel biting into her wrists, a constant reminder of her stripped freedom. The police car moved smoothly, but every turn felt like it was leading her deeper into the unknown. The muffled voices of the officers up front carried an air of mockery. She couldn't hear their words, but their tones told her everything she needed to know. Her gaze drifted to the sky beyond the window, and suddenly, another memory filled her mind. A bright sunny day, and her as a 14-year-old girl standing by the window of her room. Life had felt simple then, but it had shattered in a single moment. Her older brother, Isaiah, had been her hero. In the evenings, he would tell her stories about people who changed the world, unafraid to stand up against the system. He believed everyone had a right to be heard, that truth always prevailed. But on that day, his truth ended on the asphalt. Isaiah had been walking home from practice when a police patrol stopped him, accusing him of suspicious behavior. Naomi had heard the shouting through the window, seen him raise his hands to show he was unarmed. Then came the gunshots. Isaiah fell to the ground, and Naomi, frozen in terror, could only watch. Her family fought for justice. They hired lawyers, reached out to advocacy groups, but the case was buried. The police claimed the officers' actions were justified, and Isaiah's death became just another statistic. That day, Naomi swore she would never let the system win again. That promise became the foundation of her future. She became a lawyer to fight for those who couldn't defend themselves. But now, sitting in the back of a police car, she felt like that helpless girl once more. The car pulled up to the station, and Naomi's heart pounded as they led her inside. The gray building loomed over her, its dim lights casting long shadows. Inside, the air was cold, the walls sterile. Every step felt like a descent into something darker. Her attempts to speak were met with silence or curt orders to stay quiet. She knew her rights were being violated, but she also understood their game. The more she resisted, the harder they would push. They placed her in a small holding cell with concrete walls and a single dim light. The chill of the floor seeped through her shoes. She asked to make a phone call, but the officers ignored her. Left alone, Naomi sat in the silence, trying to suppress the anger and frustration that bubbled within her. She tried explaining her situation to passing officers, but their dismissive smirks only deepened her sense of isolation. Meanwhile, Marcus Carter received a call at home. The voice on the other end was frantic, a colleague of Naomi's, reporting that she had been arrested. Marcus felt a surge of dread but forced himself to stay calm. He immediately began making calls. First to the local police station, where his inquiries were stonewalled. Then to the advocacy groups Naomi often collaborated with, rallying their support. He even reached out to journalists, determined to ensure Naomi's case wouldn't be swept under the rug. At the station, the precinct chief entered Naomi's cell. His expression was smug, exuding confidence in his authority. He placed a sheet of paper on the table and leaned back in his chair. "We can settle this quickly," he said, his tone deceptively pleasant. "Sign a confession for resisting arrest, and you'll be home within the hour." Naomi looked at him, her gaze steady despite the turmoil inside. Signing meant admitting guilt. It meant betraying everything she stood for. Her voice was calm but firm. "I won't sign anything." The chief's smirk faltered for a moment before he leaned closer, his tone turning cold. "Are you sure? It's your choice. But I'm not sure it's the right one." Naomi knew this was only the beginning. The hours ahead would bring more pressure, more games. But she wouldn't break. Somewhere out there, she knew Marcus was doing everything he could to get her out. All she had to do was hold on. The cold, unrelenting glare of the overhead light made Naomi Carter blink more often than usual. Her cell was a small concrete box, its damp walls marked with stains and cracks. The only sound came from the steady hum of the ventilation, a background noise that amplified the emptiness around her. Occasionally, footsteps echoed from beyond the door, accompanied by muffled voices of officers. Their tones carried a mocking confidence that reminded her she wasn't alone, though the thought brought no comfort. Sitting on the cold bench, Naomi leaned back against the wall, trying to keep her composure. Anger simmered beneath her calm exterior, building with each passing minute. Her thoughts wandered to her early days as a lawyer, to the first cases she took on with an idealistic hope of making a difference. One memory stood out sharply, her work with the Mason family. They had come to her, desperate and defeated, after losing their home to a predatory lender. Naomi had uncovered blatant violations in their contracts, confident the law was on their side. But the court ruled against them. The system favored power and money over justice, and it was a bitter pill to swallow. Naomi still remembered the look in Mrs. Mason's eyes, kind but dimmed by despair. "Do whatever you can," the woman had said. "We can't fight anymore." Those words stayed with Naomi, a haunting reminder of why she couldn't give up. Even when everything seemed hopeless, there was always a chance to push forward. Now, in the freezing confines of the cell, Naomi felt a grim kinship with the people she'd fought for. The same system she had tried to hold accountable was now turning its weight against her. But as the anger built, so did her resolve. She wasn't alone. She knew Marcus would already be working to get her out. His unwavering support had always been her anchor. Marcus Carter, upon receiving the call, moved with the precision honed by years of experience in the NSA. His position gave him access to information and opened doors that would otherwise remain closed. He wasted no time reaching out to trusted colleagues, uncovering details about the officers involved in Naomi's arrest. Jenkins and Reed, names he recognized from previous investigations into police misconduct. Despite their records, they had avoided consequences, shielded by a system that protected its own. Marcus also called an old friend, a journalist known for exposing corruption. Their collaboration on past cases had brought justice to light, and Marcus knew the man wouldn't hesitate to help. They agreed that making Naomi's case public would be crucial. Time was against them, and Marcus understood the urgency. He couldn't let this incident be swept under the rug. Inside the station, the cell door creaked open. Jenkins, the tall, wiry officer, stepped inside with a smug grin. He left the door slightly ajar, but it wasn't a gesture of kindness. Leaning casually against the wall, he crossed his arms and studied Naomi with a look of disdain. His presence radiated a sense of control, as though he thrived on moments like this. "You think your connections will save you?" he said, his tone dripping with mock sympathy. "We've seen plenty like you. They all think they're special, that their friends or their status will make a difference. But they all end up the same." Naomi remained silent, her gaze steady. She had seen men like him countless times, those who wielded their power to belittle and intimidate. Her silence seemed to irritate him, as if her refusal to engage undermined his authority. He took a step closer, leaning down so their faces were level. "You think anyone will believe your version of the story? Cameras around here break all the time." "By accident, of course," he added with a sneer. Her heart clenched. The implication was clear. The footage from the station, which could have proven her innocence, was gone. She knew it wasn't an idle threat. If the recordings were erased, her word would be pitted against theirs, a battle she knew would be nearly impossible to win without evidence. The weight of the system pressing down on her felt suffocating, but she refused to let it break her. Every instinct as a lawyer told her to stay calm and think strategically. Jenkins finally straightened up, his smirk lingering as he walked out. The door clanged shut behind him, leaving Naomi alone with her thoughts. She sat on the bench, staring at the floor as her mind began to race. Her years in law had taught her to adapt, to find a way forward even when the odds were stacked against her. She wasn't going to let this moment define her. Her story wouldn't end like her brothers or the Masons. She would fight not just for herself, but for everyone who believed justice could still prevail. The sound of voices in a nearby room caught her attention. Two officers were talking, their words carrying through the thin walls. They spoke with the casual arrogance of people who assumed no one was listening. "Cameras? Yeah, we already wiped those. Who's gonna check?" "No one cares," one of them said, laughing. "She's just another loudmouth," the other replied. "They all break eventually." Naomi's hands clenched into fists. Their words solidified her resolve. This fight wasn't just about her anymore. It was about exposing the rot within the system. She knew Marcus was working tirelessly on the outside. All she had to do was hold on, stay strong, and keep believing that truth would find its way out. Naomi Carter could hardly believe she was free. The process of her release on bail had been long and challenging, but when the cell door finally opened, she felt the weight lift off her shoulders. It was the first sensation of lightness she had felt in days. Behind bars were her thoughts, her anger, and her fears, but now, standing at the threshold of freedom, she knew one thing for sure: this step was just the beginning of her fight. Marcus stood beside her, his gaze filled with determination but also hiding the concern he had kept hidden through all these exhausting hours. He knew that what was happening to Naomi would have consequences not just for her, but for both of them. Fighting against the system was far more complicated than it seemed. But Naomi had always been his strength, his anchor, and he was ready to stand beside her until the very end. As the door opened and she stepped into the light, she was greeted by her friends and colleagues. Their faces showed relief, but also questions and concerns. They understood that what had happened to Naomi wasn't just a personal tragedy. It was an event that could affect anyone who had ever been a victim of police injustice. The activists and journalists who had supported her from the start now welcomed her as a symbol. But Naomi understood that, for her, this battle was just beginning. As they moved through the corridor, her thoughts returned to the moment when she had sat in that cell. The cold, the nerves on edge, but at some point, her fear had turned into resolve. When the officers had refused to let her make a phone call, she realized that all her efforts, her career, everything she had fought for, could be wiped away with one simple lie. A lie that could overshadow her truth and erase her identity. That was when she fully understood that her fight wasn't just personal, it was a challenge to everything she had ever believed was just. Marcus had helped her walk out of the building, but even on the threshold of a new chapter in her life, she couldn't forget those left behind, those still in the shadows of injustice. Some hadn't been as fortunate as she had been, and they hadn't been able to fight the system. Naomi looked at Marcus and knew she wouldn't rest until justice was served. She wouldn't let it go. From the first moment they left the building, Marcus was already acting. He reached out to his colleagues to find out more about the officers involved in her arrest. Jenkins and Reed had been on the radar of human rights organizations for some time. The system had protected their misconduct, but Naomi and Marcus knew everything could be proven. They began gathering information, running their own investigation. After a few days, their efforts paid off. They managed to access internal reports that mentioned scandals involving these two officers. It turned out that Jenkins and Reed had been involved in several cases of violence and unlawful actions, but all investigations into these matters had either been suppressed or dismissed. Knowing that these two officers had a history of wrongdoing only strengthened their resolve. Every new discovery confirmed that the system was not functioning as it should. Marcus was determined, but he also understood that Naomi needed more than just information. She needed support. He suggested they collaborate with a human rights organization that could help not only with lawyers but also with exposing the hidden violations. Naomi, though hesitant at first, finally agreed. The system was too powerful, and a lone fight could have been doomed to fail. "You're not alone in this fight," Marcus said as she agreed. "We have those who've been through what you've been through. You remember how many people have gone through this. We have to help them." Naomi felt her shoulders relax. With each step toward the truth, she realized that only together could they overcome the system. And now she had a team she could fight for, not just for her clients, but for herself. Soon, they arranged a meeting with the human rights defenders. Naomi felt a wave of relief, but she also knew that there was still a long road ahead. However, one thing was clear: her spirit was unbroken. And now she was fighting not just for the truth, but for giving others a chance to be heard. After Naomi's release, she felt like she had entered a new battleground. Everything she had been through could not go unnoticed. The police were quick to publish their statement. In it, they claimed Naomi had been arrested for resisting arrest and that the officers' actions were entirely justified. The statement went on to assure the public that all actions by the police were within the law. It was the typical rhetoric used to hide the truth that they had used lies and manipulation to twist the situation. Naomi clenched her fists as she read the statement on her phone. The words from her opponents were now used as weapons against her, and now even if she wanted, it would be hard to prove her innocence. Society was watching her with skepticism, and now the police's public accusation became another stone on her path. She knew that if they could turn the case against her by using lies and manipulations, she had to be ready to defend her name and the truth. Marcus noticed how Naomi struggled with the new accusations. He had already told her that their fight would not be easy, but he also knew they could not give up. With every step, with every new document they gathered, they were getting closer to the truth. But as expected, the opposition was growing more dangerous. Some of Naomi's colleagues began to doubt her version of the events. Naomi was shocked when she heard these doubts from people she had considered allies. In their eyes, she saw fear of damaging their own reputations. Fear that being involved in a case that had attracted media attention and caused a storm might reflect poorly on their own careers. "Are you sure about what you're saying?" one of her colleagues, someone she had worked with for years, asked her. His eyes avoided hers as he said it. "What do you mean?" Naomi felt the tension rising. She had never considered her colleagues to be weak, but now their words felt like betrayal. "Well, this is kind of too loud, too complicated. Are you sure the officers really acted like that?" Her response was silent but firm. She couldn't believe that someone who had witnessed injustice firsthand could doubt her words. But she didn't try to convince him. Too much was at stake. Marcus noticed that all of this was starting to wear Naomi down, and he decided to act. He used his connections within government structures to gather information on the officers involved in her arrest. Jenkins and Reed had been on the radar of human rights organizations for some time. The system had protected their wrongdoing, but Naomi and Marcus knew everything could be proven. They began gathering information, conducting their own investigation. A few days later, their efforts paid off. They managed to access internal reports that mentioned scandals involving these two officers. It turned out that Jenkins and Reed had been involved in several cases of violence and unlawful actions, but all investigations into these matters had either been suppressed or dismissed. Knowing that these officers had a history of misdeeds only strengthened their resolve. Each new discovery confirmed that the system wasn't working as it should. Marcus was determined, but he also understood that Naomi needed more than just information. She needed support. He suggested they collaborate with a human rights organization that could help not only with lawyers but also with exposing the hidden violations. Naomi, though hesitant, finally agreed. The system was too powerful, and fighting it alone could be doomed to fail. "You're not alone in this fight," Marcus said as she agreed. "We have those who've been through what you've been through. You remember how many people have gone through this. We have to help them." Naomi felt her shoulders relax. With every step toward the truth, she realized that only together could they overcome the system. And now she had a team she could fight for, not just for her clients, but for herself. Soon, they arranged a meeting with the human rights defenders. Naomi felt a wave of relief, but she also knew that there was still a long road ahead. However, one thing was clear. Her spirit was unbroken. And now she was fighting not just for the truth, but for giving others a chance to be heard. Naomi sat in her office, gripping a glass of water, but she couldn't force herself to take a sip. Her fingers trembled, and her eyes were slightly reddened from exhaustion. Each day seemed to pile on more doubt. All her efforts, all her struggles, were turning into sleepless nights and growing feelings of insecurity. She tried to find the strength to keep moving forward, but everything around her was starting to weigh her down. The family she had fought so hard to protect might now become another casualty of the system she was confronting. The fear of what her fight might cost her family was so intense that at times it seemed as though this battle could destroy everything she had ever built. In her mind, the question echoed, what if her fight led to the destruction of her children's lives? She remembered how her own parents had endured loss, how her father had gritted his teeth to keep the family safe but had, for a moment, lost his strength after the injustice he had faced. Naomi couldn't allow the same fate to befall her family. It all felt so complicated. Even the support she felt from her colleagues and activists couldn't drown out the voice of doubt in her mind. Naomi understood she had to do more than just fight for herself. But in the process, she was losing her confidence. Every phone call, every message from journalists and human rights organizations seemed to make things even more difficult. Over time, the pressure only grew, and she began to wonder if it was all too much to bear. Marcus, seeing that her thoughts were consuming her, walked over to her and placed his hand on her shoulder. He could see that her spirit was beginning to fade, that she no longer believed in her own strength. But he knew he couldn't let her give up. "You've always been the one who couldn't turn a blind eye to injustice," he said, his voice calm but filled with confidence. "You inspire people. You show them that the truth can be found, even when it's buried beneath mountains of lies. You're not alone in this." Naomi looked up at him, meeting his eyes. There was still despair in her gaze, but in his words, Marcus infused a belief in her that she hadn't allowed herself to feel for a long time. He knew that she was stronger than she realized. This was the moment when Naomi understood that her fight wasn't in vain, even if she couldn't see its full scope yet. But even with this realization, she also understood that it was coming at a great cost. Her soul now carried the question, "How far am I willing to go?" "I know I can't stop," she replied, her voice becoming firmer. "But I'm scared. Scared for us. Scared for the kids. What if it all destroys our lives? I can't let that happen. I can't lose them." Marcus stood beside her, unwavering. He knew how hard it was for her, but he also knew that she wouldn't be who she was if it were easy. "You won't lose us, Naomi," he said, his voice strong. "You're showing all of us how to fight for the truth. And that truth, it's in your hands. And we're with you." Her gaze softened. She nodded, feeling the strength returning to her. But even in that moment, she couldn't rid herself of the thought that she wasn't just a woman fighting for justice. She was a woman who could lose everything she loved in order to achieve that justice. But despite the fear, Naomi felt that she had to keep going. Marcus continued working on the case, and soon he uncovered crucial new evidence. He found old records of Jenkins' misconduct, which became the key turning point in their case. The records revealed that Jenkins had previously been involved in several cases where he had abused his power. This discovery provided the evidence they had been searching for. It was undeniable proof that Jenkins had a history of breaking the law. "This is what we need," Marcus said when he showed Naomi the records. Naomi was shocked. This was exactly what they had been looking for. The evidence clearly showed how the officers had provoked her arrest. But when Marcus tried to upload the files to their secure server, something went wrong. The system failed twice. Then they discovered that all the documents they had collected had vanished. Everything that could have proved systemic corruption had disappeared, as if it had never existed. Naomi's heart sank. This wasn't an accidental glitch. It was deliberate. The documents that could have exposed the corruption had been destroyed. At that moment, Naomi realized that the police had allies at the highest levels. People who could erase their chances for justice. "They're closing in on us," she said with quiet determination when Marcus turned to her with a stunned expression. She knew this was no longer just a fight for her name. This was a confrontation with a system far more powerful than she had imagined. And she understood that now, with the evidence lost, they had to act even more decisively. Naomi sat in her office, her hands nervously picking at papers, but her eyes were fixed on one spot. Everything around her felt distant, insignificant. She didn't hear the sounds of the street, didn't notice how time stretched. The only noise was her breathing and the soft rustle of paper beneath her fingers. What she had just discovered couldn't be a coincidence. This day, perhaps, was a turning point, and her instincts had proven right. It all started with one of her colleagues, a lawyer she had worked with for the past several months, starting to act strangely. As always, he had promised to help, but at some point, he began becoming overly cautious with his words and actions. He tried to hide the fact that he had been in contact with certain officers, but it didn't go unnoticed. Naomi began digging into the details, and what she found shook her to the core. All the confidential data she had shared with him for further work had been leaked to the police. It was sabotage. The person she trusted, the person who was part of her team, was a traitor. Her heart froze, and for a few moments, everything around her faded. The shock and pain of realizing that her struggle was not just against the system, but also against those she considered allies, hit her hard. She had spent so much time building these connections, and now they were falling apart like a house of cards. She couldn't help but think how many others were playing both sides. Who else was pretending to support her but was secretly undermining her? But Naomi couldn't afford to lose control. She knew now that she had to act faster than ever before. She couldn't let this betrayal stand in her way. She picked up the phone and called Marcus to share the news. Marcus listened to her, and his reaction was immediate. He didn't doubt that this could be part of a broader scheme. He told her to check all their resources and be prepared for the consequences. He reassured her that they would find a way to fix the situation. But Naomi was shaken. She felt as though her world was crumbling again. Despite the betrayal, new evidence began to gain traction. The media, to whom they had provided information, didn't stay indifferent. Soon, the publication of materials that could affect the case caused an uproar. Public opinion began to shift. People started asking questions, and journalists and human rights activists began to stir the pot. Naomi could feel how the momentum shifted in her favor. But amidst all this activity, Naomi felt a sense of relief. She saw how public sentiment was beginning to align with her side, how people started believing her version. This was a turning point. She knew that now, when the truth was exposed to a wide audience, they were on the right track. But this moment of triumph was overshadowed by one event: the tension in her relationship with Marcus. When they were finally at home, the conversation between them escalated into an argument. Marcus was worried. His eyes showed anxiety as Naomi realized what was happening. He was concerned for their children's safety, for their future. Naomi understood his fear, but she couldn't agree with him. Her heart and mind told her one thing: they couldn't stop now. But she could see his face changing when he spoke about what might happen if their family became a casualty of the system. "We can't keep going like this, Naomi. This is threatening our future. You can't risk the kids." His voice was strained, but there was also pain. Naomi felt her heart tighten. She knew he was right, but she couldn't stop. She couldn't just turn a blind eye to it all. "You don't understand, Marcus. We can't just walk away from this. We can't let them keep destroying lives because we're scared. I can't stop. I can't just let this go," she responded fiercely. Marcus looked at her, and in his eyes, there was both understanding and fear. "Do you want us to lose everything? Do you want our children to be in danger because you can't stop?" Those words hit her hard. She wanted to scream, to tell him that he was wrong, that she couldn't stop. But for a moment she started to doubt. Because no matter how righteous her cause was, the cost was immense. The fear for her family was growing. This wasn't just a fight for justice, it was a fight for everything she loved. Marcus came closer, and his voice shifted to something softer, understanding that she couldn't step back. But the fear for their family remained. "We'll fight, but if something happens to the kids," he trailed off, but his look made it clear that their safety came first. Naomi felt her heart break with the weight of his words. But deep inside, she knew her choice wasn't just about her own fight. It was more than just a desire to win. She had to go to the end because she knew, if not her, then who? Naomi stood in her office, holding the new file that had just been handed to her. Too many days had been spent searching, and now she finally saw the result. On her phone screen, a video appeared, filmed by a random bystander, which became invaluable evidence. The footage clearly showed officers Jenkins and Reed intentionally provoking her. It was captured from several angles, and it was evident how they pushed her toward aggression, a reaction they could later use against her. The video was a clear violation of their duties. Naomi couldn't believe she had finally found what she needed. When she saw the footage, her heart raced. This wasn't just proof of her innocence. It was evidence that the entire situation, her entire battle with the system, hadn't been a coincidence. These officers weren't acting on instinct. They were part of something bigger that she had been trying to expose. Her hands shook as she picked up the phone and called Marcus. Her voice trembled, but there was excitement in it. "This is what we need," she said, holding back her emotions. "We can finally prove that they provoked me. We have the evidence." Marcus paused for a few seconds, processing the information. When he spoke, his voice was filled with resolve. "This is a big step. We need to be ready for their resistance. But this is what we need to turn everything in our favor. Now we have to prepare the publication. This will not only confirm your version but also show how deeply they are involved." Naomi realized that with this material, they could change the course of the case. But she also knew that the system would resist, that the forces against them were powerful. She didn't yet know the consequences of this breakthrough, but she was ready to face whatever came next. Meanwhile, in another part of the city, Officer Reed was trying to flee. When he realized that the situation was becoming too dangerous for him, he packed his things and attempted to leave the city, hoping to escape responsibility. But the police were keeping a close eye on him. On his way out, he was arrested. His attempt to flee ended in another piece of the puzzle falling into place, one more link in the chain of revelations that was now ready to collapse on those responsible. When he was detained, he made no attempt to resist, as if he knew what was coming. As he was being escorted from the car, he turned and said a few words that would become another confirmation of what Naomi had suspected all along. "I was just following orders," Reed said, his voice low but filled with resignation. "It comes from the top." These words echoed in Naomi's mind when she learned of his arrest. They confirmed her worst suspicions. Reed wasn't just an officer doing his job. He was part of something bigger, something that was hidden behind the facade of law and order. Naomi knew that now her fight wouldn't just be with the police but with the system that allowed them to act with impunity. This moment became a turning point in her struggle. Now she had not only evidence but also the testimony of the officer himself, who might have just revealed part of the truth. But at the same time, she realized that this was far from the end. Everything she could do now was prepare for the fact that this battle would be against the highest levels of power. The system wouldn't give up without a fight. When she met with Marcus again, she knew that they had to act quickly. Time was working against them, and every step they took was leading them closer to confrontation with those in power. But she was determined to go all the way, not backing down despite the fear for her life and the lives of those she loved. Naomi and Marcus knew that this revelation was just the beginning, and now they needed to be ready for the fact that this process would change not just their lives, but the lives of many others. It all depended on whether they could use this revelation to actually change the system. Naomi stood in her office, holding the new file that had just been handed to her. Weeks of tireless work had finally brought them to this moment. The story of her case had quickly become a symbol of the fight against systemic corruption. Media outlets, activists, and citizens alike rallied around her, turning her into a face of resistance. She had become a symbol for anyone who had ever faced injustice, for anyone who had ever been ignored or crushed by a corrupt system. Soon, her name was recognized everywhere. But alongside the newfound support came a harsh reality. There were too many people who did not want the truth to come out. Naomi could feel how each step forward only made her more vulnerable. Too much had been exposed, and too many people now knew her name. At times, it seemed like every move she made would lead to a new threat. But despite that, she pressed on, knowing there was no turning back. Marcus was always by her side, watching her closely. He noticed the toll this fight was taking on her. They had survived so much, but now everything was starting to shift. He knew that they couldn't stop. Their victory wasn't just about their personal story, it was about something much bigger than that. It was about the many others who had suffered, and who had never been able to fight back. Despite the pressure and fatigue, Naomi couldn't ignore the wave of relief that came with the shifting public opinion. The media, journalists, and human rights organizations had started to turn the tide in her favor. With every new revelation, people were beginning to see the truth. The battle wasn't over, but now Naomi and Marcus could feel the winds shifting. Soon, Naomi and Marcus began working closely with human rights organizations, helping other victims of police misconduct. This was the next step in their fight. After gathering all the evidence in their case, they realized they couldn't just fight for themselves. They had to fight for others, for those who didn't have the same power, the same platform to speak up. They began meeting with people whose stories mirrored their own, offering them the support and guidance they needed. What started as a fight for Naomi's freedom had grown into a larger movement to expose the corruption and to demand real change. But even as they worked toward new projects, Naomi couldn't shake the feeling that this victory had come at a high cost. Winning felt sweet, but there was so much more to be done. The realization that this victory was only one small step in a long fight weighed heavily on her. She understood now that it wasn't just about exposing the truth, it was about continuing to push for change, and that would require everything she had left. Later that evening, as she sat with Marcus, She felt the weight of the months of work finally beginning to settle on her shoulders. She looked at him, and in his eyes, she saw the same mixture of pride and fatigue. They had made it through so much, and now they could say they had won. But this victory was only the beginning. "We proved that truth is stronger," Naomi said quietly, but with certainty. "But this is only the beginning. We have to keep going." Marcus smiled, but his gaze remained serious. He knew she was right. They had won one battle, but the war was far from over. And he was ready to keep fighting alongside her, because he believed in her, and in what they could accomplish together. "I know," he replied, his voice resolute. "We'll do whatever it takes to change the world around us." Naomi felt her faith strengthen with his words. She wasn't alone. With him, she could go further, keep fighting for others, for those who couldn't fight for themselves. Standing together, Naomi realized that her victory wasn't just a victory in the courtroom. It was a moment when she could say she hadn't lost. She had found the strength to win the hardest battle of her life. And that victory was only the first step in the long road ahead, a road she would walk with Marcus and with all those who were ready to stand by her. As they sat there together, Naomi thought to herself, "Now we move forward." The victory gave her strength, but the knowledge of the work ahead made her move forward with even greater resolve. The rally was filled with thousands of people. The square was crowded, the air buzzing with anticipation. Naomi stood on the stage, taking in the sight of the crowd. These faces, these people, they weren't just here to listen, they were here to hear what she had to say, to feel the power of her words. With every new step, with every effort she had put forth, she realized that she and Marcus were not just fighting for one case. They were part of something much bigger. The microphone in her hand was heavy, but she held it steadily. She knew she needed to give these people not just words, but hope. They had to believe that real change was possible. And when she began speaking, her voice was filled with strength. "We have seen injustice," she began, her words piercing through the crowd. "But we are not afraid. We are no longer silent. We will no longer let the truth be hidden." Her words sparked a fire, one that lit up every soul in the crowd. People began to cheer, and some even started chanting her name. Naomi felt the strength returning to her. This was not just her victory, it was a victory for everyone who stood here, for everyone who was ready to fight. They were part of this moment. And this moment was not just the end of one path, it was the beginning of another, one where every step would matter. Naomi understood that her words today could be the catalyst for change. But deep inside, she also knew that the system would not change overnight. This was just one victory, and the price of it had been high. Despite the media coverage, despite the public support, she was a realist. Change doesn't happen in a day, and it certainly doesn't come without sacrifices. After the rally ended, Naomi and Marcus stood on the stage, watching as the crowd dispersed. Some people approached them to thank them, to say a few words, or simply to sit together. But Naomi could not forget that the real work had only just begun. She and Marcus had been witnesses to how difficult even small steps could be. In this fight, they needed to be ready for anything. Marcus stood beside her, his face betraying no sign of exhaustion, but in his eyes, there was concern. He knew that their victories would not come without consequences. This was just the first win, and they both understood that they had only just begun. The fight for justice wasn't over yet. "We've made a big step," he said quietly, his voice filled with certainty. "But you know this is just the beginning. The real fight has only just started. We need to be ready for what's coming." Naomi nodded. She knew he was right. But at that moment, she felt the weight of everything they had gone through. And yet, she understood that this was only the first chapter. "We will fight for those who can't speak for themselves," she said, her voice steady and unwavering. "We will fight until we change the system. Because this is not just our fight. It's everyone's." She looked at Marcus, seeing the same understanding in his eyes. Together, they had been through so much. They had lost so much, but they had gained even more: strength, faith in justice, and the understanding that their fight meant something. Together, they could face anything, no matter the threats, no matter the pressure. When they returned home, to the Carter house, Naomi sat down on the couch and looked around. She could feel how the space had changed. Inside her, something had shifted, a feeling that they were standing on the threshold of something greater. It wasn't the end, it was the beginning of a new chapter. A clean, unwritten chapter, where everyone would have their voice, and everyone would have the right to fight for their truth. "We won't stop," she said, looking at Marcus, who sat beside her. "We will do this. For us, and for everyone who's watching." Marcus took her hand, his gaze full of pride and resolve. He knew that they wouldn't just continue their fight, they would show everyone that truth is always stronger than lies. They stood on the threshold of a new phase, and this phase was filled with hope and challenges. But they were ready to keep fighting for what was right.